The quiet I was searching for was not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of an unknown name. It was the profound, liberating peace of anonymity, a state of being I had come to value more than any auction record or glowing museum review. After 2 decades of living as a myth, a ghost who painted masterpieces on the world's forgotten walls in the dead of night, I had come to this gritty, neglected corner of the city to finally become a man again. My name is Julian, and my sole, driving ambition was to be a nobody. For 20 years, I had been the street artist, known to the world only as Nix. I was a phantom who moved through the urban landscapes of Berlin, São Paulo, and Tokyo, leaving behind large, intricate, and deeply political murals that would materialize like apparitions at dawn. My work was celebrated in the rarefied air of the high art world and hunted by the municipal authorities of a dozen countries. My anonymity was both my shield and my signature, but a near fatal fall from a scaffold in Berlin, a moment of blinding pain that had shattered my leg and my nerve, had been a brutal awakening. The myth of Nix had become a cage. I had vanished, trading the adrenaline and the danger for the quiet, deliberate, and honest work of a man alone in his studio. I had invested the fortune my ghostly alter ego had accrued into a 3-story, converted brick warehouse in the Northwood district. It was a neighborhood of proud, industrial bones, a place of crumbling beauty that was now in the slow, inexorable grip of a gentrification so aggressive it felt like an invasion. The building was my fortress of solitude, and its vast, 50-foot, windowless eastern wall was to be my first canvas as a new man. For the first time in my life, I was not going to work in the shadows. I had been commissioned, under my real name, Julian Thorne, by the city's Cultural Affairs Office for a major public art project. The mural was to be a celebration of Northwood's soul, a tribute to the forgotten history of the mills and factories, and the blue-collar workers who had been the city's heart. It was my attempt at a new life, a life in the light of day. I had spent a week prepping the wall, the rhythmic scrape of a wire brush against the century-old brick a kind of penance, a sloughing off of an old skin. I was 100 feet up on a hydraulic lift, applying the first, stabilizing coat of gesso, when a voice as sharp and grating as a circular saw cut through the quiet morning. "This is an outrage. I will not have this neighborhood turned back into a slum." I looked down to see a woman standing on the sidewalk, her hands on her hips, her face a mask of incandescent fury. She was a perfect specimen of the neighborhood's new, invasive species designer athleisure wear, an aggressively modern haircut, and an aura of absolute, unquestionable entitlement. "Good morning," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Do not good morning me," she snapped, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at the pristine white wall. "You are painting graffiti. This is a historic industrial property, not a canvas for some low-class delinquent." "It's a city-commissioned mural," I explained calmly. "I have all the necessary permits." "I don't care if you have a handwritten note from the mayor," she retorted. "I am Margaret Sterling, president of the Northwood Neighbors United, our community's homeowners association, and we have very strict aesthetic covenants designed to protect and enhance our property values. Garish, inner-city graffiti is not part of that vision. It is the very definition of the urban blight we have all worked so hard to eradicate." Her words, the clinical, sterile language of a developer, told me everything I needed to know. I did a little research on her later that day. Margaret Sterling had been a high-powered real estate developer who had, 5 years earlier, tried to build a massive, soulless luxury arts concourse in this very neighborhood. Her project had been defeated by a fierce coalition of local artists, and longtime residents who had fought to preserve the area's authentic character. My mural, a project designed to honor that very authenticity, was, to her, a deeply personal insult, a living symbol of her own humiliating defeat. "This is your one and only warning," she declared, her voice a low, menacing hiss. "You will cease and desist this vandalism, immediately. If you do not, I will use every tool, legal and otherwise, at my disposal to have this monstrosity removed." She turned and stalked away, a general who had just declared war on a history she could not defeat and an art she could not comprehend. I stood on the lift, the smell of the gesso a clean, hopeful scent in the city air. I had come here to leave the ghost of Nix behind, to be a simple artist, but I now realized, with a profound and weary sadness, that I had only traded one kind of battle for another, and the enemy this time was not the police, but a woman who saw the soul of a neighborhood and called it a crime. Margaret Sterling's crusade against my mural began with a relentless, systematic campaign of bureaucratic warfare. She wielded the HOA's Book of Covenants like a weapon, and the violation notices, printed on a heavy, linen-textured paper that felt both expensive and threatening, began to appear at my door with the steady, predictable rhythm of a siege engine. The first fine, for $500, was for an unapproved exterior architectural modification. The notice was a long, rambling screed about the importance of maintaining the historic, industrial character of the building, a character she was now, ironically, claiming to protect. I responded with the patient, methodical approach of a man who had spent years navigating the Byzantine bureaucracies of a dozen different countries. I sent the HOA board a registered letter containing a full, bound copy of my commission from the city's Cultural Affairs Office, the building permits, and a letter from the city attorney's office clarifying that a city-sanctioned public art project was, by definition, not a violation of a local HOA's aesthetic code. Her response was to ignore my legal documentation and issue a second fine, this time for the scaffolding, which she deemed an unsightly and hazardous temporary structure. It was during this initial phase that I began to understand the true, pathetic depth of her animosity. I saw her one evening in her own loft, a vast, sterile white box of a space that was visible from my own. She was standing in front of a large, framed architectural rendering on her wall. It was a glossy, idealized image of the Sterling Arts Concourse, the failed luxury development project that had been her professional Waterloo. Her husband walked by, made a dismissive comment, and I could see her posture stiffen, her face a mask of bitter, impotent rage. Her war against my mural was not just about history. It was about her own. She was trying to erase the symbol of her defeat by erasing my work. The fines continued, each one a new and more inventive twist of the knife. I was fined for the improper storage of hazardous materials, my sealed cans of spray paint. I was fined for the chemical odor of the paint. I was even fined for a noise violation for the quiet, almost inaudible hum of the hydraulic lift. My regular calls with Isabel, my former dealer, and now my only trusted link to the art world, became a source of both comfort and frustration. "She's fining you for the smell of paint." "Julian," she asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and amusement. "This is absurd." "It's more than absurd. Isabel, it's a violation," I said, the exhaustion clear in my voice. "Let me call a few people," she offered. A word from the Minister of Culture in France about the importance of protecting a living artist like Nix might quiet her down. "No," I said firmly. "Nix is dead. I am Julian Thorne now. I have to fight this battle as myself. To use that name, that power, it's a violation of why I'm here. My resolve to keep my past buried was tested when Margaret's campaign escalated from the bureaucratic to the physical. I arrived at the mural one morning to find that a section I had just completed, a series of detailed, poignant portraits of the women who had worked in the old textile mill, had been defaced. A bucket of thick, ugly, beige house paint, the official HOA-approved color for all exterior trim, had been splattered across their faces. It was an act of such profound, aesthetic violence, such a clear attempt to erase the faces of the powerless with the color of the powerful, that it felt like a physical blow. The act was deniable. Of course. It had happened in the dead of night. But I knew it was her. It was her color. It was her rage. I did not call the police. I spent the next 3 days in a state of quiet, focused fury, meticulously restoring the portraits. The work was a form of prayer, a defiant act of remembrance. When I was done, their faces, proud and resilient, stared out at the neighborhood once more. That evening, I installed a network of discreet, motion-activated security cameras, a sad but necessary concession that my war was with an enemy who had no rules of engagement. I was a man who had painted in some of the most dangerous cities in the world, who had dodged police and criminals alike. But I had never faced an enemy as petty, as personal, and as profoundly nihilistic as a woman who would use a bucket of beige paint to try and erase history. The act of restoring the defaced portraits was a quiet declaration that I would not be intimidated. This, of course, only served to fuel Margaret's fury. With the risk of being caught on my new cameras, making further acts of direct vandalism too dangerous, she retreated to her preferred battlefield, the court of public opinion. The Northwood Neighbors United private Facebook page became her personal propaganda outlet, a digital echo chamber where she could shape the narrative and solidify her support. Her posts were a masterclass in the art of the dog whistle, blending class-based snobbery with thinly veiled fear-mongering. Dear neighbors, one post began, accompanied by a deliberately distorted, wide-angle photo that made my mural look chaotic and menacing. I know many of you share my deep concern about the massive graffiti project that is defacing the beautiful, historic brickwork of the old warehouse. This is not art. It is a symptom of urban decay. It is a visual invitation to the criminal element that we have all worked so hard to push out of our community. This is not just about aesthetics. It is about our safety and our property values. She was a brilliant strategist of slander. She was framing my work, a tribute to the neighborhood's working-class soul, as a threat to the new, wealthy residents' financial portfolios. The comments from her followers were a predictable chorus of manufactured panic. Thank you for your leadership. Margaret, we must stand together against this. I saw a teenager in a hoodie looking at it the other day. It's already attracting the wrong element. The effect of her campaign was to cleave the neighborhood in two. The newer, wealthier residents, who had bought into Margaret's vision of a sanitized, upscale Northwood, began to treat me with an open hostility. They would glare at me from their car windows, or hurry their children past the mural as if it were radioactive. But the older residents, the ones whose families had lived and worked in this neighborhood for generations, became my silent, watchful allies. They would stop and watch me work, their faces filled with a quiet, appreciative recognition. An old man, his hands gnarled from a lifetime of labor, once stopped me on the street. He pointed a trembling finger at a section of the mural depicting a group of steelworkers. "My father," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's the one on the left. You got his eyes just right." These moments were the fuel that kept me going, but the constant, low-grade warfare, was exhausting. My internal conflict intensified. I had come here to escape the myth of Nyx, to be a simple artist. But this fight was forcing me to think like Nyx again strategically, politically. I was analyzing her tactics, planning my countermoves. My calls with Isabel in Geneva became a source of both comfort and a painful temptation. "Julian," she said during one call, "this is madness. Let me make a call." A single, anonymous tip to the art editor at the Times about a rumored new Nyx mural would bring a media circus to her doorstep that would shut her down in an instant. "No," I insisted, though the offer was a siren song. To use that name is to become that person again. It's a violation of the very reason I'm here. I have to win this as Julian. But I was beginning to realize that Julian might not be enough. Margaret was not just slandering me. She was trying to legally erase me. She filed a formal complaint with the city's Historic Preservation Board, a brilliant, vicious move designed to use the city's own laws against its own commission project. The complaint was a work of artful fiction, arguing that my garish, modern graffiti was a desecration of the building's historic character. The hearing was a public showdown. Margaret gave a soaring, passionate speech, a masterclass in feigned concern for historical integrity. When it was my turn, I did not argue. I presented. I showed the board the extensive historical research I had conducted, the archival photographs, the blueprints. I demonstrated, point by point, how every element of my mural was in a direct, respectful, and intentional dialogue with the building's century-old history. The board's decision was a swift and total vindication. They not only dismissed her complaint as being entirely without merit, but they voted to issue a formal, public commendation for my innovative and deeply respectful approach to historical preservation through public art. I had won. I had publicly and officially defeated her on her own chosen ground. As I walked out of that hearing room, I saw her face. The mask of cool, confident authority was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. I had not just beaten her, I had humiliated her. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that a woman like Margaret Sterling would never forgive such a public defeat. Her next move would not be a complaint to a board. It would be an act of total, unrestrained war. The public humiliation at the Historic Preservation Board hearing was the final, catalytic event that pushed Margaret from a state of obsessive malice into one of pure, unrestrained desperation. Her authority had been challenged and found wanting. Her expertise had been exposed as a hollow sham. She had lost the battle of public opinion, and she had lost the battle of legal procedure. All she had left was the brute force of the HOA, and she decided to wield it as a blunt instrument of pure destruction. She called an emergency, closed-door meeting of the Northwood Neighbors United Board, a group of her hand-picked, loyal sycophants. There, in the dead of night, she pushed through an emergency resolution. The resolution, a work of breathtaking legal arrogance, declared that my mural, despite the city's approval and the Historic Preservation Board's commendation, was a direct and egregious violation of the community's aesthetic covenants. It invoked a little-known but powerful clause in the HOA bylaws that gave the board the authority to take direct, remedial action to correct any covenant violation that was deemed a persistent and ongoing nuisance. The resolution concluded by authorizing the board to hire a private contractor to restore the east-facing wall of the property at 412 Iron Street to a neutral, board-approved color. She was going to paint over my mural. She didn't mail me the notice. She delivered it herself, the following afternoon. An act of personal, triumphant cruelty. I was up on the scaffolding, putting the final, delicate touches on the central portrait of a young, female union organizer, when I saw her standing on the sidewalk below, a smug, victorious smile on her face. "Mr. Thorne!" she called out, her voice ringing with a false, cheerful finality. "I have some wonderful news for the neighborhood." She held up a piece of paper. "This is a formal notice from the board. As per a unanimous vote, we have declared your graffiti project to be a covenant violation, and we have authorized direct, remedial action. A professional painting crew will be here at noon, this Saturday, to restore the wall to its proper, pristine condition." I stared down at her, a cold, hard knot of disbelief in my chest. Saturday, the unveiling, the ceremony with the mayor and the press, was scheduled for Sunday afternoon. She had timed her attack perfectly. She was going to destroy the mural less than 24 hours before it was to be officially presented to the city. "You can't do that," I said, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I have a permit from the city. This is a sanctioned piece of public art." "You have a permit to paint on your own, private property," she retorted, her smile widening. "And your private property is subject to the binding covenants of our association, which you agreed to when you purchased it. Our private covenants supersede your public permit. Our lawyers are quite clear on this point." She held up a second document. "This is a temporary restraining order, which will be served to you on Saturday morning. It will legally prohibit you from interfering with the work crew in any way. If you try to stop them, you will be arrested." This was her checkmate, a brilliant, vicious, and legally sound trap. She was using the power of a private contract, the HOA agreement, to override the authority of the city. She had me. "I suggest you get all of your personal effects off the wall before Saturday," she said, her voice dripping with scorn. "It would be a shame for them to get splattered with beige paint." She turned and walked away, a conquering general who had just announced the terms of an unconditional surrender. I stood on the scaffolding, my hands trembling with a rage so profound it felt like a physical illness. She was going to destroy it. She was going to erase the faces of the mill workers, of the union organizers, of the forgotten men and women whose stories I had spent months trying to tell. She was going to silence them, permanently, with a bland, soulless coat of beige paint. My internal debate, my long, agonizing struggle about whether to reveal my own past, to use the power of the ghost of Nix, was over. She had brought the fight to my work, to my very soul, and she had left me with no other choice. I descended the scaffolding, my mind a cold, clear engine of calculation. I walked into my studio, picked up my phone, and made the call. "Maria," I said, my voice quiet, but filled with an urgent, steely intensity. "It's Julian. We have a catastrophic problem. Margaret Sterling and the HOA are sending a crew to paint over the entire mural at noon, this Saturday." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by a string of furious, untranslatable Spanish curses. "She can't do that," Maria finally exclaimed. "The city commissioned this. The mayor is supposed to unveil it on Sunday." "She can, and she will," I said. "She's using a loophole in the HOA covenants. She's legally in the clear. But I have a countermove, and I need you, and the mayor's office, to trust me." "What is it?" she asked, her voice now grim and serious. "You need to move up the unveiling," I said. "Not to Sunday. Not to Saturday afternoon. I need you to move the press conference, the ceremony, the mayor, everything. To this Saturday, at noon. Exactly. There was another long pause. I could hear the gears turning in her brilliant, political mind. "You're setting a trap," she said, her voice now a hushed whisper of awe. "I am," I replied. "She wants to erase my work in a public spectacle. I'm going to give her one, just not the one she's expecting." Saturday dawned, a day of brilliant, cloudless, and deceptive beauty. At precisely 11:45 a.m., the white commercial painting truck, a rolling Trojan horse of beige destruction, pulled up to the curb in front of my building. A crew of 4 men, their faces a mask of bored indifference, began to unload their equipment ladders, scaffolding, and a dozen 5-gallon buckets of the soul-crushing beige paint that was Margaret's signature color. Margaret Sterling arrived moments later, a triumphant general ready to survey the final battlefield. She was flanked by her HOA lawyer and a small contingent of her most ardent supporters. A larger crowd of residents had gathered across the street, a silent, conflicted audience to the impending execution. Margaret strode to the center of the sidewalk, a clipboard held like a scepter, her face a mask of sublime, righteous victory. She saw me standing by the door to my building, and she graced me with a small, cruel, and final smile. "Well, Mr. Thorne," she called out, her voice ringing with a false, cheerful finality. "The moment of civic improvement has arrived. Last chance to stand aside and avoid a costly legal entanglement." I said nothing. I simply stood my ground, my arms crossed, and waited. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my face, I hoped, was a mask of calm. This was the most audacious gamble of my life. At noon, the foreman of the painting crew, a large man with a weary expression, approached Margaret. "We're all set up, Mom. Ready to start priming the wall whenever you give the word." "Excellent," she said, her smile widening. She turned to the crowd, raising her voice for dramatic effect. "Let the restoration of Northwood begin." She raised her hand, a conductor about to begin a symphony of destruction. It was at that exact, exquisitely timed moment that the first of the black city government sedans arrived. It pulled to a smooth stop at the end of the block, followed by another, and then another. A silent, imposing motorcade of 4. A swarm of people emerged, men and women in sharp suits, photographers with long-lensed cameras, and television news crews, their equipment already hoisted onto their shoulders. They moved with a practiced, professional urgency, their focus entirely on the scene in front of my mural. The door of the lead car opened, and a man emerged who was instantly recognizable to everyone in the city. It was Mayor Thompson, his face a mask of cheerful, public relations determination. He was flanked by Maria, from the Cultural Affairs Office, and a group of city council members. The mayor strode into the center of the street, which was now a chaotic hub of media activity, and stopped, a look of profound, theatrical confusion on his face as he took in the scene, the painting crew, the buckets of beige paint, and a stunned, frozen Margaret Sterling. "Margaret," the mayor said, his voice a perfect blend of surprise and dawning displeasure. "What on earth is going on here? I thought the press conference for the unveiling was scheduled for today." He didn't wait for her to answer. He turned to the assembled media, his voice now booming with mayoral authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press, thank you for joining us on this magnificent day. We are here to celebrate a landmark moment in the cultural life of our great city. Today, we officially unveil the Northwood History Mural, a breathtaking work of public art that this city was proud and honored to commission. He turned and gestured dramatically at my mural, a work now bathed in the flash of a dozen cameras. "And we are here," he continued, his voice rising, "to honor the artist, a man who has graced our city with his singular, world-renowned talent, a man who, for the first time in over a decade, has chosen to step out of the shadows and create a public, officially sanctioned masterpiece under his own name." He turned and looked directly at me. "But he is also a man the international art world knows by another name. A name synonymous with courage, with truth, and with a revolutionary artistic vision. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound honor to introduce to you the artist known as Nix." The name dropped into the charged air like a lightning strike. Nix, a living legend, a ghost, a man whose illegal anonymous works sold for tens of millions of dollars. The reporters and photographers surged forward, a tidal wave of chaotic energy, their cameras now focused entirely on me, the quiet, anonymous man in the paint-splattered jeans. The graffiti that Margaret had been about to erase with a coat of beige paint was not just a city-commissioned mural. It was a secret, priceless work by one of the most famous and mysterious artists on the planet. The mayor looked from the stunned, ecstatic faces of the press, to the painting crew, to the buckets of beige paint, and then finally, to Margaret Sterling's pale, horrified, and utterly broken face. "Margaret," he said, his voice now dangerously quiet, a blade of pure, cold steel. "What, exactly, were you about to do to my city's new cultural landmark?" The aftermath was a swift, public, and brutally efficient immolation of Margaret Sterling's world. The moment the name Nix was spoken, her reality, and the reality of everyone on that street, was irrevocably altered. The story was no longer about a local HOA dispute. It was an international art world event. The image of the powerful, reclusive artist, Nix, being unmasked, standing in front of his new masterpiece while a local HOA president tried to have it painted beige, was a tale of such perfect, delicious irony that it became an instant global sensation. Margaret was not just defeated, she was annihilated. She was the villain in a story that was being told on the BBC, in Le Monde, in the New York Times, the mayor's office, in a masterful act of political jiu-jitsu, publicly condemned her actions as an act of cultural vandalism and an attack on the city's artistic heritage. The city attorney's office, at the mayor's firm's suggestion, immediately filed a massive lawsuit against the Northwood Neighbors United HOA for the attempted destruction of city commission property, seeking damages that threatened to bankrupt the entire association. The HOA board, facing a legal and public relations catastrophe of epic proportions, turned on her with a savage, self-preservational fury. She was stripped of her presidency in a humiliating emergency vote. A forensic audit of her tenure was launched, which quickly uncovered a long history of financial mismanagement and the use of the association's funds to fuel her personal real estate vendettas. Faced with social and financial ruin, a lawsuit from the city, a lawsuit from her own community, and the eternal, global shame of being the woman who tried to paint over a Nix, she and her husband sold their loft at a loss and vanished. Their names now a permanent punchline in the annals of art history. My life was transformed. My anonymity, the quiet cloak I had worn for so long, was gone forever. But in its place, I found a new, different kind of peace. The ghost of Nix was gone, and in his place was Julian Thorne, a public artist, a respected member of his community. The Northwood neighborhood, once a battleground, was now a destination. People from all over the world came to see the Nix mural. The property values, The very thing Margaret had been so hysterically trying to protect skyrocketed. The old and new residents, once divided, were now united by a new, shared sense of civic and cultural pride. The HOA, under a new, humbled, and artist-led board, was reformed. The oppressive covenants were rewritten, and the Vulcan Lofts finally became the true haven for artists it had always claimed to be. I still live in my loft. The northern light is still my constant, forgiving companion. I still paint, but I no longer feel the need to hide. I often walk down to the street and stand with the crowds, watching them look up at the faces of the mill workers and the union organizers. I see the history of this place, their history, reflected in their eyes. The work is no longer a secret, a conversation with a ghost. It is a dialogue with the world. And in that, I have found a new kind of silence. Not the silence of being alone, but the quiet, profound peace of being understood.